Before we start this new painting tutorial, I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much to all of you who watch these videos and have subscribed to this channel. Honestly, I'm so happy that some of you guys are enjoying these videos and picking up a few things to use in your own work. And getting to know so many of you, talking with you guys in the comment section each week, it's an absolute privilege. And so truly, I just want to say thank you so much to all of you, and I'm glad you're here. Let's get right into this painting tutorial. Up on the screen now are two high-resolution photos of my completed painting. If you want to paint along with me, feel free to use this as a reference to work along with. So now, because this painting tutorial is going to be a bit more on the advanced side of things, I'm going to leave out a lot of the simple stuff. You know, things like PSI, paint reductions, transfer, and drawing techniques. If you are painting this one, I'm sure you have all that stuff down. So with that said, I am working here on a gessoed canvas, just like I'm using for all of my paintings. Just like always, my completed painting on the left side of the screen, and we're painting on the right. This entire painting is obviously monochromatic. It's one color. The color that I'm using for this is black by Schmincke Aero Colors. And for the majority of this painting, I have it reduced about 20% with distilled water. And what we're going to do is start with the left eye here. I'm using a circle template here to first line up with the pupil of my initial drawing and just spray in a small amount of paint. I directed that paint to the lower part of the pupil because the top part is going to be cut off by a specular highlight within the eye itself. That way, if there's less paint up there, it's just easier to erase later on. And now for the outer edges or contours of the iris itself, I'm just looking for a circle here that's going to fit the right side of it. This is where you're going to see the limbo ring on some people. I'm just lining up the edge of that circle template and just spraying a small amount of this black paint. And now obviously all of these values are going to need to be much darker later on, but for now we just go light, easier to clean up any mistakes. And so what I'm doing right now is ignoring everything else in the portrait, just focusing all of my attention within the iris itself. You can see that I'm using just a bunch of different freehand shields here to line up around the contours of the iris itself. The transitions on the edge where the iris starts blending into the sclera, again, that's where the limbo ring is going to be. And of course, those transitions on the top and bottom where the eyelid is just covering up a small amount of that iris. Once I have those boundaries painted in, I'll switch over to the airbrush freehand and just spray some paint in the center, cover up some of that white gesso. Now there's no white in this mixture, so I have to control all of my values by how much paint I spray. Any of the lighter values or the highlights are going to come from the canvas itself, so we're using a subtractive or a negative technique here. The iris itself is loaded with textures. There's crypts, furrows, collagen, a lot of highlights and shadows within every single iris. The eye itself is also wet. It's going to reflect a lot of light. Sometimes it's almost like a small spherical mirror. So the first thing I'm doing here is using an ink eraser. It's going to be a little bit more aggressive. And I'm just erasing out this very thin highlight here, just within the center of the iris that curves up. And the goal of this obviously is to lighten up that area, but it's also to put a reference point in because I'll come back to this later on, add more detail in there. And then I'll switch over to my electric eraser. You can see that the end of the sand nib comes to a very sharp point. And that's just because I ran this over a piece of sandpaper just to sharpen it up at the tip, and I'm going to draw in these two bright highlights just above the pupil. These, of course, are the highlights that are directly reflecting the light source, so on this one, it's above and to the left of the subject. And then I'm also going to use this electric eraser just to add some more detail into this other highlight. Now, an electric eraser is a little tricky to use to draw in lines like this, but what I like to do is just kind of slightly hold it off the surface so I'm not applying too much pressure. That way, it's going to remove less paint, and you're also going to get some more control because the eraser isn't going to be skidding around on that canvas. From here, I want to set in that boundary just above the eye itself. So I'm going to use a freehand shield here and just spray in that transition point between the eye and the upper eyelid. Black paint gets very dark very quickly, so you have to go slow here. Just spray a small amount. Then I'll also use that circle template, line it up with the edge of the iris, spraying a little bit more paint so we get a bit of a gradient here, a transition from lighter in the center to darker toward the edges. Now that paint obviously darkened up everything, so I'm coming back in with my electric eraser, just bringing these highlights out again. And now before I start adding more paint into this area, I'm going to use my ink eraser and just sketch in, basically draw in some of the lines where the highlights are going to be later on. This way, as I darken up everything, I'll still be able to see them. It's going to be very subtle, but they're still going to be there. So I just have a reference point. When I come in later, I could add some more detail. I'll use my freehand shield to mask off that lower eyelid, and then I'm just going to add some value into the iris, just darken up a few areas. One area that's going to need to be very dark is the top part of the iris, where the upper eyelid is kind of casting a shadow on it. And so I just line up my shield here and spray a bit more of this paint just below it. And while I'm doing this, I'm pulling a little bit farther back on that airbrush trigger, so it's going to release more paint, and you can see we get a darker value. Remember that this painting is all done with a single color. It's all done with black, and all of those values, meaning how dark and how light everything is controlled by how much paint is applied to that canvas. And so now at this point, I'm happy with the position of the iris, the proportions. I could start adding more paint here. And just like I mentioned earlier, I want to slowly build up to the darkest value. It just gives me much more room for error. When I make a mistake, it's much easier to clean up. And speaking of mistakes, which are always going to happen in painting or drawing, I made one right here. I didn't tape off the circle to the left of the one that I'm spraying in, and some of the overspray from the airbrush just got into that circle. So we have a big line of paint now on the left side of the sclera, or the whites of the eye. There's a lot of ways to clean up mistakes. You could fix pretty much anything in a painting if you're clever, use some different techniques. So for this mistake, I'm going to use the easiest technique that I know. I'm going to use a softer eraser. This is a pink one. It's a 7056 by Faber-Castell. And I'm just going to lightly erase into this area to pull out as much paint as I can. So just a few passes over that mistake, and you can see that it definitely lightened it up. But because I was using a shield there, there's still a pretty sharp line. And so for that edge, that sharper line, I'm going to switch over to the ink eraser. This is a 7058. It's a bit more aggressive than the pink one. And I'll just erase into that transition point. Just lighten up that edge so we don't have a huge contrast there between the mistake area and then the whites of the eye. You can see that when I finish with that, it's much softer, it's much less noticeable. And when I come in later to darken up the edges of the eye itself, this is going to get hidden away. You're not even going to notice it. The eraser that I'm using here is one that I use all the time in my graphite drawings. This is the Tombow Mono Zero. It's a soft eraser, but it's very small and comes to a very sharp point at the end, so you get a lot of control with this thing. Because this eraser is so soft, it's not going to remove that much paint. It's really amazing for graphite drawings because you could really pull out some sharp lines. But with an easily erasable paint like the Schmincke Aero colors, it's going to remove some paint, so you can get some pretty soft blends and transitions if you work slowly with it. But if I want to pull out a lot of paint, for like a really bright highlight, this is the last eraser that I'm going to reach for. This is mainly used for some softer blends and softer highlights. And as I continue along with this iris, I'm basically just drawing with these erasers. I'm paying attention to my reference, trying to notice where I see those highlights, the directions of them, and the proportions, and then just drawing them in with the erasers. If I accidentally erase too much paint, I go back to the airbrush, glaze a little bit more of this black on top to darken everything back up. And so now from here, what I want to start doing is adding in some of the skin textures and some of the features around the eye. The first thing that I'm painting in here is the upper eyelid and some of the folds within the skin just above the eye, below the eyebrow. So you'll see me use a few different types of freehand shields here, just constantly moving them around, getting parts of that curve to fit my drawing underneath. And what I'm essentially doing here is just blocking in these shapes. You can see that I even painted some of them at some sharper angles. It's not going to look like that in the final painting. But for now, I just want to get these in place. I can smooth them, round them out later on. For the left side of this upper eyelid, it kind of curves up. So you'll see me just kind of switching the shield around, looking for a part to fit. And then once I have a few of those edges painted in with the shield, I could just use the airbrush freehand a little bit and just kind of clean up some things. Moving along to the lower eyelid, I want to paint in that transition between the sclera of the eye and the lower eyelid itself. So again, just using a part of a shield, just painting the left side of it here. When I remove the shield, you can see just how lightly I sprayed that paint. And then going back to the upper eyelid, I'll line up my shield with the right side, spray a bit of paint up. So you can see what I did here. I basically just painted in transition points between values. At this point, it's looking very flat. It looks like outlines. It almost has a cartoon look to it. But I painted these in knowing that they're the reference points of where I'm going to need to add paint or where I'm going to need to remove paint. And then once I start doing that, that 2D shape that we're seeing right now will start shifting. The illusion will start looking more like it's three-dimensional. Like areas are kind of rounding away, some areas are sticking up. And the reason that I'm telling you this is just because there's a lot of times in painting or drawing, especially during the early stages, where things look a little bit messy. And if you're just starting out, you might start doubting yourself at this point, thinking this looks nothing like the final painting. I don't know how I'm going to get to it. So one thing that I've always just reminded myself is that during the early stages, when I'm blocking in things, trying to get values in place, it's just the foundation. It's the first steps to get to a final painting. So you can see here that I used a few different small shields just to paint in the edges on the right side of the eye where the tear duct is. And so now the photo reference that I'm using for this painting isn't the highest quality. Some of the areas around the eye are a bit softer than I would have preferred. So not an ideal situation, but I can still see them in the reference. So what I'm doing is just trying to paint them in a little bit softer, not adding too much detail, but just mainly focusing on those transitions of value, areas that move from light to dark and from dark to light. As I'm moving along to the right side, I want to set another reference point in. That's the edge of the nose. So I'm lining up a shield here, spraying a little bit of this paint over to the right, just so I have another transition point in. And you'll notice that I didn't paint in the entire nose. I just painted in the area that I'm working on. A little bit of that paint sprayed to the right where the shadow on the nose is going to be just sets a boundary. So I know where this eye is going to have to stop. Now that everything's in place, I'm going to start adding more paint into the areas that need to be darker and sharpening up some of the edges, some of those subtle outlines around the eye itself. Again, I don't really like to think of these as outlines. I think more of them as transition points between values. And so a bit of paint into some of these areas to darken them, sharpen them up. And if anything's a little sloppy, you'll see me using the eraser here, clean up some areas. I'm using that soft eraser that I mentioned earlier and just lightly pulling out some paint in the whites of the eyes. As long as I don't use too much pressure and I overlap these eraser marks, I'm not going to get any texture with this eraser. It takes a bit of practice to do that in a smooth surface that has a bit of tooth, but you can get it down in no time. After a few corrections within the iris itself, what I want to do here is paint in this shadow, this transition on the lower part of the lower eyelid. And so what I'm going to use here is a ripped piece of cardboard that has kind of a textured edge. And as I spray over this, some of that texture is just going to get transferred to the canvas below it. Now, I didn't do a great job at ripping this out. I probably should have ripped a curve in it, but because it's basically a straight line, I could just kind of move it around, spray bits at a time, and get this to kind of connect so we get a curve down here. And now for the left side of this transition, it's a bit softer, so I'm just going to use the airbrush freehand here. When I do that, it almost looks like a seamless curve here underneath the eye, but on the right side, it's a bit sharper. On the left, it's a bit softer. And again, because the paint is so light here, if I made a mistake, if an area was too sharp or too defined, I can always lighten it back up. The two common ways to lighten up an area is to use a lighter opaque paint, but that of course adds that annoying color temperature shift, so I'm just sticking with my eraser, and again, this whole painting is only that one color black. Another very important reference point that I want to get in here is the lower part of the eyebrow. Again, I'm going back to that ripped piece of cardboard and just lining it up with the right side, spraying a bit of paint above it. As I move along to this next part, I had to dim the studio lights a little bit. The bright lights are really good to give you a nice sharp image with very little grain in the video. But when you're painting, really bright lights just kind of wash everything out. They're kind of blinding. So as we start working into the more subtle tones within the skin texture, I just dim them a bit. So the video is going to be a bit darker, but still clear. Before I start moving into those skin tones, I'm just going to make one more pass over this iris again. You can see that I glaze some paint over the top of it just to kind of darken everything up. That texture underneath is still going to stay there, so I'm just going to build up some more texture on top of it. And then I'm coming back into this area with an ink eraser with a nice sharp point on it just to pull out some very thin highlights and add a bit of texture into the iris. And of course the electric eraser to go back over those specular highlights. For a few of the wrinkles or creases underneath the eye, I'm going back to that ripped piece of cardboard. I'm lining it up with my initial drawing and then just spraying a small amount of paint along the edge. Now I added these wrinkles underneath the eye before I added any paint down. The wrinkle went in first. And the reason that I did it this way is because if I didn't like it or I made a mistake, I could just erase the whole wrinkle out. If there was a layer of paint down, it would just be a lot more work. You have to kind of like blend out your eraser marks. This is just so much easier. I'm switching over to my erasers here, starting first with the soft one, working into the sclera, lightening it up a little bit more, and then using that harder eraser to pull out some of the sharper highlights underneath this eyelid. I could also use a soft eraser on that lower eyelid to pull out a softer highlight along the center of it. You can see that I'm even working into some parts of the eye with the soft eraser and I'm not really getting texture. The trick to doing that is just to make sure that you overlap those soft eraser marks. And of course, don't use too much pressure. You don't want to pull out all the paint, just a small amount on top. I want to get a few of these eyelashes in right now. They're very subtle. They're kind of tucked away just above this upper eyelid, but they are still noticeable. So what I'm using here is a black colored pencil. That's my favorite tool for drawing in eyelashes. And I'm essentially just sketching in the shapes of them, trying to make them a little bit wider at the base. But at this point, it's not that big of a deal. I just want to get them in place. I can refine them later on. And then for the shadow at the base of those eyelashes, it's a bit softer. So I'm using the airbrush freehand here, spraying paint into this area, slowly building it up to get a nice dark value in here. From here, I want to start working down into that skin texture underneath the eye. So you'll see me coming in with the erasers, pulling out some more highlights again, and then using that ripped piece of cardboard to get another wrinkle here right underneath the eye. And then for some of the texture, I'm just going to spray it in freehand, just a few soft dots here with some erasing in between them for the highlights. And then I'll take my airbrush and lightly glaze some paint into this area. Just a thin dusting of paint, something to work into. That very thin glaze of paint is going to kind of act like a mid-tone for the flesh textures. And it obviously darkens up the bright white gesso, but it also gives me something to erase into. So I could erase into those mid-tones to pull out some highlights. Just like how we worked on the eye, everything below it for the skin texture is going to be built up in layers. I'm slowly going to be adding paint, removing it, and just repeating that process over and over. As I'm working my way down this left cheek, you will see me block in some more parts of the nose, just so I have that boundary. I know where the right side of the cheek is going to end. And one thing that I'm always thinking about, it's always in the back of my mind, is where the light source is on the painting. And the easiest way to spot the light source, especially for beginners, is just take a look at the eye. Notice where the specular highlight is. And it's obvious here that the main light source is just to the left of center and slightly elevated. And so that means shadows are going to be in the opposite direction. The shadows are going to be to the right and slightly lower than any of the highlights within the painting. So I'm glazing a small amount of paint here just on the lower part of the cheek. That way I have some value in there. Now I could erase into it and pull out my highlights. The area that I'm working on here, right underneath the eye, usually called the bags of the eye, just some fat that builds up underneath all of our eyes. And what I notice is that an area of it's raised, so it's catching some more light. And then of course, on the opposite side of that, where the light isn't hitting it, there's going to be a shadow. And there's a lot of this going on within this area right underneath the eye. There's a lot of small transitions from light to dark. And remember that the lighter area is going to look like an area sticking up toward the light source, one that's catching the light. As I'm erasing out these highlights, you'll mainly see me using a soft eraser just so I can get some control and slowly lift these out. I definitely want texture within this painting, but I want to get to it slowly. So I'm starting mainly here first with that softer eraser and making sure that each eraser mark overlaps. Each one of those strokes overlaps each other so it doesn't look like sketching in there. It looks like an even mass of highlight. And just because there's so many small transitions of value, I'm speeding up the video here so you can see how I work through this. Basically what I'm doing here is just drawing. I'm stepping back from the painting occasionally, squinting my eyes, trying to pay attention to shifts in value. And when I see some masses of light, some areas that need to be brighter, I use that softer eraser, slowly work into that area to pull out a mass of highlight. And there's no tricks or hidden secrets that you need to know in order to do this. It's removing pigment using a negative, which is a subtractive technique, subtracting the paint from the surface, exposing some of that light, that white gesso underneath. And then in order to apply the pigment, to apply the darker values, we're using an airbrush with acrylic paint, so it's more of a modern approach. But this technique goes back centuries. It goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. This is essentially drawing 101. It's the foundational techniques for anything within the visual arts. As I work my way down here, one other reference point that I want to get in is the contours on the left side of the face. So we have the ear over there, and so there's a lot of ways to mask it off. I'm going to use a freehand shield and just slowly work my way around it, spraying some of this black paint to the left. I set up the background in the portrait of this man to be mainly pure black, so it's going to be a lot more forgiving. You just have to spray some paint into that background. No sort of details or transitions of value within it. And you'll notice that as I painted in some of that background, I'm jumping right back over to the flesh tones, working into them, just continuing along. It's important to remember that surrounding values or colors are always going to influence the way you see the part of the painting that you're working on. Now that we have some black paint on the left side of the painting, I'm seeing some of these areas differently. Some of them seem a little bit brighter than they did before. And that's because the background before was pure white, making these areas seem a little bit darker than they actually were. And so after some more work, some more scuffing up that paint in the skin texture, I decided that it's time to paint in this ear so I could see the values of the skin texture a little bit clearer and more accurately. The reference for this painting is a photo. Obviously, I'm not working from life here. And because of the wider aperture on the lens, the left ear is out of focus, so there's not too much detail in this part of the painting. It's basically just values, shifts and transitions from dark to light to dark. So I was able to paint the ear in pretty quickly, maybe 5 minutes of work, mainly using the airbrush, taking advantage of that soft spray pattern that we naturally get to get those soft blends. And of course, using a softer eraser, the pink eraser here, just to pull out some very soft and subtle highlights, not with that much texture. And now with that ear in and some of the background painted in along the left side of the painting, I'm going to see the values, the lights and darks within the skin texture much more accurately. And so again, just like I mentioned earlier in the video, I'm just going to go back into the skin texture and continue those layers. Basically just drawing with this area, repeating the same steps over and over of adding, removing, adding, and then only moving on to the next section, which is going to be the beard, where I feel like I've done enough work for the time being. I already did a full 2-part tutorial on how I painted the beard a few weeks ago, so make sure you check those out. And that, my friends, is where we're going to wrap up the first part of this video. I do hope that you guys enjoyed it, maybe pick something up to use in your own painting. I know that I went through a fair amount of information in this one, so hopefully it does help some of you guys out. Before I go, I want to say thank you so much for the incredible, kind, and generous support of the current channel members. These people really help keep this channel going. I can't thank all of you guys enough. I'd also like to welcome and thank the newest members, Dan G., Carl and Lynn, both for rejoining. Thank you guys. And Gunpla Weekend, thank you so much for the generous tier 2 and welcome to the channel. I also want to thank you, Blue, for your very generous super thanks over this last week. Thank you so much. The photo references and grids will be included, of course, up on the members page. And if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to me. And so part 2 is going to be next week, and I will have a few members video coming up on this portrait as well. So I just want to thank all of you so very much. I hope all of you guys are having a great week. I'll see you back here next Friday.